Okay. So, being in the middle. In the middle of what exactly? Let's talk a little bit about the post-medieval period. So here we are, right? This is our frame of reference. And we're gonna go back. These are our ancient and medieval cultures, and then this is modernity. Just these 500 years forward. That's it. That's all that counts. These last 500 years of human history. Does that apply globally? Does that apply to everyone? So, like, yes, okay, Europe, and by way of colonization, America. But do we really consider the rest of the world to have just magically graduated into modernity at exactly the same time as the rest of the world? This is a tricky kind of thing. Well, let's ask ourselves, what is modernity and how do we define it? So if we use 1492 as the guide, well, then we are literally defining modernity as the age of global colonization by European peoples. Cool. Or if we back it up a little, we're like, no, that was kind of earlier. Well, 1452 and 55, that is when the Portuguese were allowed by decree of the Pope to start enslaving Africans. So do we define modernity as the era of racialized slavery and oppression? Is that... what if we don't use a particular date, but we think more about ideas instead of exactly this time, but, as ideas change? All right, fine. Let's talk about the Renaissance, right? Renaissance means rebirth, right? Rebirth of what exactly? So here we are, we have modernity, which is apparently a rebirth of something, assuming that we know what that is. But when we look at a Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance, for example, it starts well before 1500 and it continues after 1500. In fact, Marco Polo is a part of the Italian Renaissance, but he's traveling in the 1320s and England is solidly in the Middle Ages in the 1320s. Like, Chaucer hasn't even come around yet. So, like, Petrarch is an Italian Renaissance poet that the medieval English poet Chaucer copies from. So, it's not like a strict this and then that sequence, I don't think we can say. The Renaissance does eventually reach Northern Europe in the 1500s, the 16th century, through the 1660s-ish. That's a squidgy date because 1660 is defined by England in particular with the restoration of the throne after their English Civil War. I'm like, yeah, monarchs, off with their heads. Oh, wait, oops, Puritans are worse. So they undid that. However, does this apply? Does this concept of a Renaissance make any sense? What is it a rebirth of? Specifically antiquity, and specifically not just any antiquity. We're talking about Greece and Rome, the two cultures that characterize the term classical antiquity. So this is why if you study classics, we're talking Greeks and Romans, and if you study Sanskrit, an older language, then you are an Orientalist, as offensive as that term is. So antiquity really only applies to Greece and Rome. Classical antiquity. So Renaissance is a rebirth of Greece and Rome? Kind of. So we get that a bit in painting and sculpture. Let me rephrase. This is what we are taught the Renaissance includes. A flowering of painting, sculpture, art, even literature, increasing secularization, a revival of learning after the Dark Ages. the scientific revolution, the Protestant Reformation, free markets and capitalism, and laying the groundwork for liberal democracy and the Enlightenment, which comes afterwards, right? So let's evaluate these as to whether or not we think that this is really what modernity is. Is that really a rebirth of of classical culture? Not totally, especially because a lot of what's happening there isn't related to Greece or Rome. So a lot of times this culture is called early modern instead of Renaissance, because the Renaissance is a term that's kind of outdated by skipping over, because it skips over the Middle Ages as if nothing happened, which for sure is not the case. Things happened. Not the Dark Ages, though, right? The Dark Ages implies two things. It deploys the language of light and dark as good and evil, rational and irrational, and yes, that becomes racialized. Number two, it has an implicit uncivilized note to it. And that's where this idea of either Renaissance or early modern comes from, is the idea that in antiquity they were civilized, and then they kind of lost track of that a little bit. And uncivilized barbarians took over, and Europe was thrown into an age of darkness and chaos and lack of learning and backwardness. And then humanism emerged out of nowhere, apparently, to light the way for mankind forward. Okay, that's what the language of the Dark Ages means. We're not going to call it that. I hope none of you ever call it that ever again, because shit was happening. Right? And it wasn't all part of this narrative of like a loss of learning. That is not at all correct. There is some differences from Greece and Rome, for sure. Number one being Christianity. But that does not at all do justice to the immense amount of intellectual culture, learning, and art that is actually happening, and invention, but also warfare. But it's not like we don't engage in warfare. So let's get rid of that language, go back to our early modern humanism, and let's examine whether or not this narrative fits what we actually know. So as far as the Italian Renaissance and painting and sculpture, that goes, that one pretty much fits, right? The use of perspective in painting is something that is advocated by an artist himself, a painter, Leon Battista Alberti, where he writes about how painting is supposed to show you everything as it appears to the human eye. And that's an interesting shift. So it's not that medieval art is just not skilled enough to represent things as appropriate to the human eye. It's that it doesn't want to. Right? What is happening in medieval art is different from what is happening in Renaissance art. And the most important factor, I think, is the use of symbolic imagery as opposed to realism. So the Renaissance, especially the Italian Renaissance painters, they really value realism. They want art to look exactly as real life. But that's not something that everyone values. That's a specific ideology. And when we fail to acknowledge it as such, we fail to appreciate that other art is trying to do other things. So we know this with modern abstract art, but maybe we don't give medieval art the same kind of credit. But let's use this leaf from this opening from the Hours of Catherine of Cleves as an example. This is Catherine over here in the corner. This is Mary. We learn a lot about their symbolic relationship based on the fact that they're different sizes. That's one. Although Catherine actually has herself depicted fairly large here for a medieval book. She thinks highly of herself. We also see that Mary is surrounded by a golden aura. That's important. She's also enshrined within an architectural frame, right? It is not supposed to look like an actual church. It is symbolic of what the church does, which is house sanctity, like Mary, right? And then we also see some interesting alignment over here with Catherine. So if we zoom in here and we look at Catherine's actual depiction, we see a couple of places where the realm of Catherine, which is housed in the margin of the manuscript, she's not the center, she's not the middle of reality, she is on the margin of the divine history of the world, centered around the incarnation of Jesus through the body of Mary. So she overlaps the frame with Mary here with her dress, which is likely pointing to a shared womanhood, right? So she has something in common with Mary, and that gives her a little bit of something that she can be in touch with in the divine, right? We also see the book here in her hands. In fact, that's probably a picture of her prayer book, which is what this picture is actually painted into. So the book itself, the process of reading the prayers, the divine office, it's actually not the full divine office that monks would use. It's called the little office of the Virgin. So this is the set of prayers that late medieval lay people would use to do their devotions. And so here she has it open in her hands, and the book itself, as well as the practice, is what helps her to cross the frame from the worldly realm into that of the divine, right? And it's probably no small coincidence that parchment, which this book is copied on, is flesh. And so when you put sacred words onto parchment, you are word made fleshing, right? Does that ring any bells about the incarnation of Christ? Believe me, this metaphor was apparent to medieval readers. So the book itself is sacramental. It crosses the boundary between the mortal and mundane into the divine. And the last thing that we see crossing over the frame is this little scroll here. And this is her prayer. It is, "O Mary, Mother of God," right? "O Mary, God's mother." So yes, Renaissance and painting and art and sculpture, it does do something new, but it's not like super new, right? It's not like never before seen. In fact, even the use of perspective, you can see, has already begun here in this late medieval form of painting. So we'll give that a check, but, asterisk. What about increasing secularism? The narrative goes that as secularism is on the rise, the division of church and state, you have then a revival of learning and a scientific revolution because the church isn't oppressing people, and a Protestant Reformation, right? That secularism leads to both of these things. That's not totally how this goes. So let's talk about how this works. Is this really going to lead us to increasing secularism, which also takes us to liberalism and democracy? And I don't mean that in the political sense. I mean that in the adjectival sense. Because who is this guy? This is Niccolo Machiavelli. And if you know anything about him, he's the Italian theorist, political theorist, who says the ends justify the means. And I think we're getting a strong lesson in that right now, honestly. So the question becomes, do you really think that this guy's thinking is what leads us to democracy? Worth wondering. More asterisks to come. Let's talk a little bit about this, right? Free markets. This is where we're at. At the end of the Middle Ages, you have mercantilism. So we have feudalism in the middle. And as you're getting to the end of the Middle Ages, you have this increasing access to goods and wealth, largely through merchants and their supply of goods, especially luxury items, to the aristocracy. So we'll talk a little bit about how that evolves from feudalism when we talk about feudalism. But let's just acknowledge that capitalism doesn't emerge out of nowhere. Mercantilism is an economic form that has been in existence for a few centuries throughout the late Middle Ages into the early modern period. And that's what gives us capitalism, right? Marco Polo, remember, he's a part of that. Not exactly the free market, but Mostly true. Okay, so that's a thing that emerges with humanism. What about the revival of learning and the scientific revolution? Do we get there from the free market? Remember this stuff? This was all learning that came from the Islamic Golden Age. And as it turns out, most of this stuff was translated from Arabic into Latin. And from its Latin form in the Iberian Peninsula, it filtered into Europe in the 12th century, right? So in Europe, from the 12th through about the 15th to 16th, depends on where you are, century, you actually have a massive quantity of scientific texts that are circulating. They're just not new experiments being done by European peoples because the European folks are learning from the Arabic writings. That is where the entire scientific revolution came from. It took root in the Islamic Golden Age. And for Europe to be able to benefit from any of it, it took centuries of processing and learning from another culture before Europeans were able to put some of those things to use. So we're going to scratch that one off. Not so much a part of humanism. What about learning? Here's another throwback. Remember that institutional history about how universities came to be? Yeah, that's solidly medieval. This is a picture of Oxford. They were definitely doing learning in the Middle Ages. So not so much a revival of learning as a rejection of a particular kind of learning that came before it, which is scholasticism. This is Descartes' famous thing, right? Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. And in his discourse on method, where he says that, he is legit like, scholastics. I just can't with them. Let's just throw it all out and start from beginning because my mind is so superior that I can definitely reason my way through anything. For real. That is the discourse of European empiricism. Is let's just throw out everything we've ever learned before because I just can't. It's a thing. So, not so much on the revival of learning, okay? What about the Protestant Reformation? Yes, that is a thing that is definitely happening. Here's what's going on. So, in 1517, Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg, Germany. That does not kick off the Protestant Reformation. What it signals is that there has been foment against certain practices of the Catholic Church already. And in 1517, Martin Luther is like, nope, F this. I'm over it. We're going to do something about it. And he doesn't actually mean to be splitting from the church yet. He is attempting to draw the church's attention to its need for reform. That's why it's called the Reformation, right? But he's not the first person to have these ideas. He's the first person to express these ideas in a moment where the church's power is waning because of the rise of secular states. Hello, Machiavelli. And because the power is shifting away from the church and towards the secular state, it means that when people come along with ideas like this, they don't get burned at the stake as often, right? John Wycliffe had some very similar ideas in the 14th century, and he was labeled a heretic not until after he died, and so they dug up his bones and burned them. But Jan Hus in Bohemia, he had a similar line of thought during the Middle Ages, and he was also persecuted as a heretic, right? So heresy is what happened to these ideas before the Reformation. So what you have with Luther is just the right combination of ingredients at the right time, right? Voila, 95 Theses. Major points here for the Protestant Reformation. They object to the sale of indulgences, which is the remission of sin for money. Donations to the church. Why don't you donate a new nave to the church, and then I'm sure that'll take 100,000 years off your stay in purgatory, right? They object to the corruption that this has caused. or that has been caused, not just by indulgences. There's a lot of other stuff going on there with feudalism and the Fourth Lateran Council. It objects to the centrality of the sacraments to the practice of the Christian faith, right? So what we have in late medieval Christianity is you have 7 sacraments, and these are the rituals that connect individuals to God. And they do that through priestly mediation, right? And the Protestants are like, no, we don't like the fact that access to God is gatekept by these corrupt priests, right? And so they promote faith as a matter of individual conscience, right? Each person, prior to this moment, faith as a matter of individual conscience is not the matter, like it's just not the modus operandi, because faith is communal. It is practiced as a group, as a community, as a whole. And you belong to a community and a worldview by participating in the church, right? And if you don't participate in the church, you likely belong to a different communal faith. So the idea that there is something individual about one's practice of religion, that's pretty new. It's not brand new, because something similar to this was part of Wycliffe's cry, including the denunciation of the sacraments. But like I said, it's like the right moment for this idea. And one of the ways that Luther advocates, Luther and other Protestants after him, one of the ways that they advocate for, excuse me, the practice of this individual faith is through sola scriptura, or scripture alone. And this is only possible because there are rising rates of literacy, right? So more people can read, and therefore it makes some sense for people to be able to mediate their own relationship with God through each person reading scripture instead of having the scripture interpreted for you by a priest. So that's a really big shift. And it's only possible because printing has recently happened. So everybody can own a Bible. That's cool. It's still written in Latin in most places, but translation is starting and it starts picking up. And by 1611, you have the King James authorized version of the Bible, which BT Dubs, he authorized so that people would leave him alone about his live-in man lover. For real. So the authorized version of the King James Bible was literally to distract everyone from casting aspersions, because he literally installed his lover in the palace with a secret passageway between their bedrooms. That's an aside. Okay, back to it. By advocating for every individual person reading the scriptures for themselves, what they are actually doing is overturning 1,000 years of exegetical scholarship in which the most learned people in medieval society have struggled with how to interpret sacred scripture. And then Protestant comes along and says, just read it. And if you could have an answer from medieval scholastic doctors, church doctors, they would be like, but there's at least 4 meanings to every scriptural text. And the meaning of that is always complex. And if you're reading for something and you get the wrong answer, which you're definitely going to do because you are human, then how do you know, right? Like medieval scholars thought long and hard about how you interpret sacred scripture, because it was not a simple process. And Luther comes along and is like, yeah, just let everybody read it for themselves. And that becomes a new thing, a brand new thing. So, yes, Protestant Reformation, that's a thing that comes about specifically because of the rejection of scholasticism. But that definitely characterizes humanism and its period, right? This also goes hand in hand with the broader acceptance of scientific work in Europe. But again, I want to highlight that scientific work is not like brand new out of nowhere. That's newly acceptable because you no longer have a powerful Catholic Church shutting down certain types of work. We talked earlier about dissection of bodies, or of corpses. for learning anatomy. We can also mention like Galileo being imprisoned and the rejection of the heliocentric universe, right? What you actually see here, this is your Earth-centered universe, right? And that actually is not how we think the solar system actually works, but that is what the church believed. That's what they had incorporated into their understanding of the world about themselves. And in so doing, excuse me, they made an entire cosmology in which humanity is God's creation and is the center of God's creation. So if the earth is in the center, then what orients everything is its relationship to God. So if you have the navel of the universe is right here at the earth, then that navel ultimately projects you up and directly connects you to God, right? Now, if the center of the universe is not earth, but earth is over here, and it's off in the periphery, and the center is the sun, an inanimate, I mean, if it's fair to say that a giant ball of flaming gas and like nuclear fusion is inanimate, but like a non-sentient object, if that is now the center of the universe, then what does that mean about this peripheral rock over here on which we live? Like, are we actually just tangential to the entire universe? And that upset everybody's understanding of the whole world and how it works, right? And this is why it was rejected for as long as it was, because who are we if God is not the central pillar that keeps our universe aligned, the axis on which we turn, because the earth is at the center of everything? If instead earth is just spinning off in the middle of nowhere, then what is at the center of meaning? Well, that becomes humanity. That's why it's called humanism, right? So yes, increasing secularization, but it's kind of more complicated than our original narrative led us to believe. Now, what comes next? All of this together is supposed to lead us to the inevitable. Remember that theory of time equals progress? The inevitable conclusion of man's own perfection, liberal democracy and enlightenment. Whoops. So, except that what actually happens is colonialism. How are these things related? Let's talk a little bit about institutional histories of disciplines, right? We're in core humanities, and the study of certain cultures is called humanities. So here you are, you have Europe. Later, once you have Euro-Americans living here, then we will call this part of the humanities as well, right? This is the humanities. So we could logically call the people to whom this applies, this study, humanitas. It's a Latin word, but these are the humans that are behind the humanities that we study. What about the rest of the world? The study of these cultures is called anthropology. And so post-colonial theorist Mignolo, he actually suggests that this creates an entirely separate category of human being according to Western perspectives that you could call the anthropos, right? The type of human that is the object of anthropological study. And let's be clear, anthropology is the study of the anthropos by the humanitas, right? These are the people who are allowed to be the thinkers. And these, at best, insofar as we acknowledge them to be human at all by calling them anthro, they are lesser somehow, and therefore need to be studied and interpreted by the real thinking people, the humanitas. So this leads us to our question of liberal democracy. If humanitas, are only Europeans and their descendants, then how do you actually create a democratic or an egalitarian society if only some people count? Right? So maybe this stuff doesn't all lead us directly to liberal democracy, right? Because what it actually led us to is Euro-American colonialism and global white supremacy. So what about the Enlightenment? We talked a little bit about that language of light and dark. Do we really want to call this moment of global white supremacy and Euro-colonialism enlightened? If not, we could call it, another name it uses is the Age of Reason, because they valued rationality. But even that is a contrast against the Age of Faith, which is what they call the Middle Ages. Do we really want to use that? I'm not super comfortable with it. You could call it Neoclassicism, right? A revival of the classical period. But like that's the same thing that we see happening in the Renaissance. Neoclassicism and Renaissance, rebirth, they're kind of the same ideas. So what would the difference be? There is the 18th century. That's an option. Let's hang on to that one. Although it does get troubled a little bit and later called the long 18th century. And that is a very specific historical argument about periods. So Neoclassicism, if we go back to that idea, as well as Renaissance, depends on that idea, again, of classical antiquity, right? Which is ancient cultures, but really we only mean European ancient cultures, right? Do these other cultures around the globe, did they have an antiquity? Do they have a classical antiquity? And if they don't, what is this for them? What is that age? So that becomes our major question when we think globally, right? When we're thinking globally, we might ask ourselves if it's fair to apply these same time periods to non-European cultures, right? And I really want us to take some time before the end of the semester to look at these other cultures we've been studying and ask ourselves, what is a fair, non-colonial way to describe its long history, right? From the moment you've been studying up until now. Where does modernity begin? And does it start with colonialism? And if it does, then how do you describe the periods of that culture before it gets to modernity, right? That's our task this week in the group project. For the rest of the lecture series, I am going to turn my attention specifically to Europe so we can talk about the European Middle Ages, because that's a thing that you are expected to know after you finish this course. Voila. That's where we get to.